In the summer of 536 AD, across much of Europe, the Middle East, and Asia, the sun simply changed. It was still there in the sky, but its light turned pale, filtered through a strange haze. Chroniclers from Constantinople to China recorded the same unsettling sight, a dim sun, as if veiled by smoke or dust, casting long, cold shadows even at midday. Medieval people didn't have satellites or atmospheric science. They had religion, superstition, and memory. And all three told them the same thing: when the sky changes, something terrible is coming. Priests declared it a sign of God's wrath. Villagers whispered of dragons or giants blotting out the sun. Some even believed the end of the world had begun. Within weeks, the world grew colder. In the Mediterranean, summer crops failed to ripen. In Scandinavia, frost struck in the middle of July. Across Asia, rice harvests faltered. By autumn, famine had begun to spread. Historians now believe this was the beginning of what some called the worst year to be alive. Ice core samples from Greenland and Antarctica suggest that a massive volcanic eruption, possibly in Iceland, had blasted so much ash into the stratosphere that sunlight itself was filtered for more than a year. The result was a planetary cooling that triggered one of the most devastating short-term climate disasters in recorded history. For the people of the 6th century, the science didn't matter. What mattered was that the rules of the seasons, the dependable rhythm of planting and harvest, had been broken. And in a time before food storage or global trade, that break in rhythm meant hunger, migration, and death. But this was not the last time such a disaster struck. Centuries later, in the so-called Middle Ages, Europe and much of the Northern Hemisphere would face another year without a summer, this time in 1315, during the heart of the medieval period. This would be a climate catastrophe that shook kingdoms, destroyed economies, and left scars and folklore that lasted for generations. In the spring of 1315, Europe should have been warming. The days grew longer, the soil thawed, and farmers prepared for the planting season. But something was wrong. First came the rains, not the gentle showers that nourished the earth, but endless, cold downpours. For weeks, heavy clouds smothered the sky, blocking the sun. Temperatures stayed unusually low, as if winter refused to let go. The ground, sodden and muddy, swallowed seeds instead of nurturing them. By May, it was clear that this was no ordinary year. Wheat fields in England were weeks behind schedule. In France, vineyards failed to bloom. In Scandinavia, snow still lay on the ground in late spring. This wasn't just bad weather, this was a crisis in the making. Medieval Europe relied on what we would now call a just-in-time food system. There were no refrigerated ships, no global imports. Most communities survived on last year's harvest until the new one came in. A bad summer meant hunger by autumn. A failed summer meant starvation. By June, the rains intensified. Rivers overflowed, flooding farmland. Grain rotted in the fields. Hay for livestock could not be dried. Cattle grew weak without feed, and disease began to spread among the herds. Chroniclers wrote of drowned villages, washed-out roads, and endless gray skies. This wasn't just an inconvenience, it was the start of what historians now call the Great Famine of 1315 to 1317. Over the next 2 years, Europe would experience mass starvation, economic collapse, and social unrest. And it all began with a summer that simply never arrived. The people didn't understand the cause. Some believed it was divine punishment for sin. Others whispered of witchcraft or demonic influence. In truth, the disaster was likely a combination of shifting climate patterns, the tail end of the medieval warm period, and a possible series of volcanic eruptions that disrupted weather across the northern hemisphere. Whatever the reason, by late summer 1315, one thing was certain: the medieval world was heading into a disaster it was utterly unprepared for. By autumn of 1315, the signs were impossible to ignore. Granaries, which should have been full from the summer harvest, stood half empty. Markets had less to sell, and what they did offer was already climbing in price. The poorest felt it first, but soon even wealthy households realized they could not simply buy their way out of trouble. There simply wasn't enough food to go around. The rains did not stop. In some regions, autumn plowing was abandoned entirely because the fields were either flooded or too waterlogged for horses to work. Livestock, already weakened by poor grazing, died in alarming numbers. Cattle plague spread quickly through herds, killing what little remained. In cities, the smell of decay mixed with the damp, chill air. By winter, hunger had tightened its grip. The bread that was baked was often mixed with ground peas, beans, or even tree bark to stretch the dwindling flour supplies. Chroniclers recorded bitter complaints about bread that tasted more of earth than grain. Meat became a rarity for ordinary people, and even the nobility found their tables less abundant than before. People began to eat whatever they could find: dogs, cats, and in some desperate accounts, the hides of old work animals boiled into a thin, foul soup. Rumors spread of worse, of human flesh being sold secretly in back alleys, though whether this was truth or fear-fueled gossip remains unclear. The psychological toll was immense. In a deeply religious society, famine was more than a material crisis, it was seen as a moral reckoning. Priests preached repentance, urging people to abandon sin so that God might lift his punishment. Public processions were held in the freezing rain, barefoot penitents walking through the mud, chanting prayers. But prayers could not change the weather. And as 1315 turned into 1316, Europe's ordeal was only beginning. The next year would bring an even greater disaster, a second failed harvest, sealing the fate of millions. The spring of 1316 should have been a chance for recovery, a fresh planting season to replace what had been lost. But instead of sunshine and warmth, the same endless, cold rains returned. Seeds rotted in the ground before they could sprout. In some places, farmers didn't even attempt to plant, they simply had nothing left: no seed grain, no surviving livestock to plow the fields, and no energy after months of near starvation. The previous winter's shortages had already driven food prices to historic highs. Now, with the second harvest in danger, panic set in. A bushel of wheat cost more than triple its normal price. In France, chroniclers recorded people paying the equivalent of a week's wages for a single loaf of bread. In England, entire villages pooled what little coin they had just to buy enough grain to keep the elderly and children alive. Disease began to follow the hunger. Malnutrition weakened immune systems, making even minor illnesses deadly. In wet, overcrowded cities, outbreaks of dysentery and respiratory disease spread fast. The mortality rate climbed, not in one dramatic wave, but in a grinding, slow attrition that claimed thousands every week. The social order began to crack. Desperate peasants raided storehouses and robbed travelers on the roads. Some nobles resorted to hoarding grain behind armed guards, turning their estates into fortified islands of food in a starving sea. This bred resentment and violence. In parts of Flanders and the Low Countries, food riots erupted, with starving crowds looting markets and bakeries. In the countryside, survival became a matter of improvisation. People dug up wild roots, stripped bark from trees, and trapped whatever animals they could catch. Chroniclers mention that great hunger bread, made from ground acorns and moss, bitter and barely digestible. Yet even in the face of such desperation, the rains continued to fall. By the end of 1316, many realized that this was no passing storm, it was a full-scale climate disaster, the kind that could change the course of generations. And for those still alive, there was one more cruel winter to endure before any hope of relief. The winter of 1316 to 1317 was not just cold, it was relentless. Snow fell heavily across much of northern Europe, and where snow didn't fall, freezing rain coated the land in sheets of ice. Travel became nearly impossible. Roads turned into frozen ruts, rivers locked under thick ice, and trade between towns slowed to a crawl. In villages, hunger became a permanent companion. Many who had survived the autumn now faced their breaking point. Without firewood or food, the poorest burned their furniture to keep warm. The thin, bitter bread of the previous year was gone. What remained was little more than boiled weeds, moss, and salted leather scraped from old harnesses. Disease claimed more lives than the cold itself. The malnourished were easy prey for pneumonia, influenza, and dysentery. Even noble households, with their larger stores, could not escape. Their wealth could not buy grain that simply didn't exist. Chroniclers in England, France, and Germany all recorded the same grim scenes: whole families buried together, villages half abandoned, and churchyards so full that burials took place in mass graves. In some regions, livestock losses were so severe that communities began slaughtering draft animals simply to survive the winter. This created a cruel cycle. With fewer animals to plow the fields in spring, the next harvest would be even harder to bring in. Religious leaders intensified calls for repentance. Monasteries organized processions and public fasts, hoping to appease what many believed was divine anger. Yet for all the prayers and ceremonies, the sky did not clear. By the time the ice began to melt in March 1317, the famine had been killing for nearly 2 years. Survivors emerged into a spring that would decide whether Europe could begin to recover or whether the nightmare would continue for yet another season. When the winter ice finally began to thaw in 1317, it revealed a land scarred by 2 years of unrelenting disaster. Entire fields lay fallow, overgrown with weeds. Villages had shrunk, their houses abandoned or collapsed from neglect. Livestock herds, once the backbone of medieval farming, were shadows of their former size. The spring planting faced immediate problems. There were too few animals to plow the land and too few seeds to plant. What seed grain still existed was often of poor quality, the leftover, damp harvest of 1316, half rotten from storage. Yet farmers had no choice but to use it. The weather, at last, began to show some mercy. By May, the rains eased, and the sun returned. Crops began to grow, but the relief came too late for many. Malnutrition had left populations weakened, and outbreaks of disease continued to claim lives even as fields turned green. Food prices remained high through the summer. Merchants who still had grain guarded it fiercely, and in some towns, markets were patrolled by armed watchmen to prevent looting. Starvation-driven crime persisted, not as wild riots now, but as quiet, desperate thefts. The harvest of autumn 1317 was better, but nowhere near enough to erase the shortage. For many, it was simply a reprieve, enough food to survive the coming winter, but not to rebuild their herds, repay debts, or refill the granaries. Still, after 2 years of unbroken disaster, even a partial recovery felt miraculous. Communities held Thanksgiving masses, and surviving chroniclers spoke of the famine as a punishment finally lifted. Yet beneath the surface, the damage was deep. Entire generations had been shaped by hunger, and in some areas, population levels would take decades to recover. The Great Famine had ended, but it left Europe weaker, more fragile, and less prepared for the next great calamity, which, just a few decades later, would come in the form of the Black Death. By the time the Great Famine ended in late 1317, Europe was not the same continent it had been just 3 years earlier. The losses were staggering. Historians estimate that between 10% and 15% of the population of Northern Europe died, millions of people in a time when every village counted its inhabitants in the dozens, not thousands. The economic consequences rippled for years. With so many dead, entire farms were abandoned. Landowners struggled to find enough laborers to work their estates, and wages, when they were paid in coin rather than food, began to rise. For peasants who survived, this sometimes meant new opportunities, but for most, the aftermath was a grinding struggle to rebuild what was lost. Trade networks had also been disrupted. With fewer goods to sell and fewer people to buy them, many towns saw their market shrink. Some communities never recovered their former prosperity, especially in remote regions cut off during the famine years. The famine also eroded faith in traditional authority. When priests and bishops had promised that prayer and repentance would end the disaster, and nothing changed, some people began to question the church's spiritual explanations. While most remained devout, the seeds of doubt were planted, seeds that would grow in the centuries to come. Perhaps the most lasting scars were psychological. Chroniclers write of a deep, lingering fear of hunger that haunted survivors for the rest of their lives. Families stored food obsessively, hoarded grain, and distrusted neighbors in times of scarcity. In art and folklore, the famine lived on as a warning, a reminder that the order of the seasons could not be taken for granted. What made the Great Famine particularly cruel was that it struck during a period often called the High Middle Ages, a time of relative prosperity and growth. For more than a century, Europe's population had been increasing, cities expanding, trade flourishing. Then, almost overnight, nature reminded humanity of its fragility. And though the famine ended, Europe's climate had subtly shifted. The medieval warm period was over, and a colder, harsher era, the so-called Little Ice Age, had begun. The Great Famine was not an isolated disaster. It was the first warning of a century that would bring even greater trials. The Great Famine of 1315 to 1317 didn't just weaken the people, it weakened kingdoms. Armies needed food as much as weapons, and in an age before long-term storage or mass transport, a famine-stricken land could not support large campaigns. Rulers quickly learned that in this fragile new reality, food could be as decisive as the sword. Sieges, already a brutal feature of medieval warfare, became even more effective. Cutting off a city's food supply was no longer a matter of months, it could break resistance in weeks. In the years after the famine, chroniclers record a rise in the deliberate destruction of farmland during conflicts. Armies burned fields, trampled crops, and slaughtered livestock, not just to deprive the enemy of resources, but to ensure they would face a second famine long after the battle ended. This tactic was particularly devastating in border wars, where already impoverished rural populations were caught between opposing forces. Even when peace returned, these communities found themselves unable to rebuild, trapped in cycles of poverty and hunger. Politically, the famine also shifted the balance between rulers and subjects. Desperate for grain, kings and lords imposed harsher taxes and requisitioned food directly from peasants. Resistance was met with brutal punishment. In some regions, the resentment this caused would smolder for decades, fueling uprisings and revolts later in the century. At the same time, some leaders used the famine to consolidate power. By controlling grain supplies, they positioned themselves as saviors, distributing food at public gatherings, often under the watchful eye of clergy who framed the ruler's generosity as a sign of divine favor. In a cruel irony, hunger became both a tool of oppression and a tool of propaganda. The memory of the Great Famine ensured that people would follow those who could feed them, or at least promise to. And in the volatile decades ahead, with climate instability continuing, that promise became one of the most valuable currencies in medieval politics. By the time Europe's fields had fully recovered, the Great Famine of 1315 to 1317 had already become more than a memory, it was a cautionary tale that shaped generations. Parents told their children stories of the years when bread turned to stone in the mouth and the summers when the sun forgot to shine. In art, hunger appeared as skeletal figures and withered fields, reminders that even the richest harvest could be swept away by the will of God or the cruelty of nature. Folklore preserved the details, the bitter taste of acorn bread, the empty granaries, the endless rain. These were not just stories. They were warnings. Historians now see the Great Famine as part of a larger turning point. It marked the end of the medieval warm period and the start of the colder, harsher climate we call the Little Ice Age. In the century that followed, Europe would face repeated harvest failures, waves of plague, including the Black Death, and long, grinding wars. The resilience of its people would be tested again and again. Yet the famine also left a quieter legacy. It forced communities to adapt, better grain storage methods, more diversified crops, and improved local trade networks to survive shortages. Religious institutions, shaken by their failure to stop the disaster, slowly began to shift how they explained such events, moving from purely divine punishment to more practical responses. Still, the fear never vanished. Even centuries later, in times of bad weather, villagers would glance at the sky and remember, not in detail, but in feeling, the dread of the years without summer. It became part of Europe's cultural DNA, a reminder that civilization rests on something as fragile as the next harvest. And perhaps that's why the story of the Great Famine still resonates today. It is not just about a medieval disaster, it's about the thin line between stability and collapse. In 1315, all it took was a shift in the wind, a curtain of clouds, and a few degrees of temperature to bring kingdoms to their knees.